We're a sports family. You're either a theater kid or you're a soccer kid. Those are the two camps. So I was raised as a soccer kid, and I didn't like kicking the ball. My parents would always say that what I liked was running down the field the fastest.
That is Sadie Schreiner. She's entering her junior year at the Rochester Institute of Technology, where she studies photography. And she is a runner. She has always been a runner.
I always loved the laps we would do before the actual gym day, which sounds like no elementary school kid's favorite part of activity. I was the fastest kid. It was what I was best at. And I've always been super competitive. I grew up with a brother who's 7 years older and a sister who's 4 years older, and they would beat me at everything. So I very much wanted to find something that I was best at, and it was definitely running.
It was important for Sadie to have running. She said it helped her get out of her head. That was especially helpful when she was back in high school. As she was dealing with all the normal stresses of being a teenager, Sadie was also figuring out her gender identity. In her senior year, she began to tell some of her closest friends and family that she was trans.
I think she identifies with running as much as she identifies with her gender. It's just a fundamental part of her.
Sadie spoke recently to post-sports columnist Jerry Brewer, who has been writing about the way that sports have become a hotspot for grievance and division.
There was a lot of different people that we considered and talked to in trying to do this essay, but I liked Sadie because of just how open she is about what it means to be transgender and a ferociously competitive athlete, and also just the line that she straddles. As a college student who's trying to understand herself and trying to be her best self, and as an athlete who, every time she has success, she faces a level of backlash that you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy.
As a trans athlete, Sadie Schreiner has been harassed extensively, both online and at track meets when she's running for RIT. People accuse her of transitioning in order to gain a competitive advantage. Sadie hopes to win a national title one day, but because of all the outrage swirling around trans people in sports, her athletic future remains uncertain. Since 2020, half of the country has passed laws restricting transgender participation in women's sports. And in the last few weeks during the Paris Olympics, we saw an example of just how volatile the question of trans inclusion in sports has become. Algerian boxer Iman Khalif and Taiwanese boxer Lin Yuting, two cisgender women, were both accused of not meeting the requirements to compete in women's boxing, with some calling them transgender.
Italian boxer Angela Carini abandoned her bout against Algerian boxer Iman Khalif after only 46 seconds. After the match, false reports surfacing alleging that Khalif is a transgender woman.
The Taiwanese boxer at the centre of an Olympic gender row has returned home to a hero's welcome. Lin Yuting won gold in her weight category while facing questions over her eligibility to compete.
All this happened after the International Boxing Association, a boxing federation not recognized by the Olympics, claimed without evidence that the two women have XY chromosomes. The story was then spread by prominent figures like author J.K. Rowling and billionaire Elon Musk. This is how the Olympic Committee president, Thomas Bach, responded to those accusations.
Women must be allowed to take part in women's competitions. And the two are women.
It was a prime example of what Jerry has called a panic over trans inclusion in sports.
I think we think that sports is a place for everyone, but I think there's a myth of inclusion about sports. And I think that we have a long history of exclusion that brave people have had to fight through to make us more inclusive, to make us more diverse. Think about Jackie Robinson and the baseball color barrier. When you think about Billie Jean King and all that she did in tennis there are always people pushed to the margins. And then here you have this issue with transgender athletes that touches upon some things that we hadn't even considered in sports in our construction of two sexes. And Sadie is up against that in a sports world that has structures, that has systems, that has beliefs that make it incredibly difficult for something that we don't quite understand to get in, to participate, to be respected as they should.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Wednesday, August 14th. Today, the story of one athlete's experience of transitioning and the efforts to include or exclude trans athletes from the world of sports. So, Jerry, tell me a little bit more about Sadie Schreiner. You said that she fell in love with running as a kid. When did she start running competitively?
Sadie always knew that she was fast, but the way sports are set up outside of just races that you would run as a kid, it's not really until middle school that you get to compete at a pretty significant level in track and field. And she just has a deep and abiding love for track and field, particularly the 400-meter race.
The second I touched the 400, I was like, this is the perfect distance. This is the race I always want to do.
But I think for someone who struggled with her identity, track and field gave her a clear identity.
And when did Sadie start to identify as trans?
I think for a long time, she felt it. She felt there was a difference between how she looked and who she truly was fundamentally.
I knew I was trans throughout all of high school. I never told anyone or did anything about it.
But it wasn't until late in her high school time that she drummed up the courage to say, okay, I'm trans and I'm going to transition.
I told my boyfriend, my family, and all my close friends that I was trans, but I didn't tell anyone at school because I didn't want to complicate anything with track and field. And I even started taking medication without telling anyone on the track team or at school. I remember I just told my coach so he knew what was going on. And then 2 months after that, I was already out of high school. So I was going into college under medication, and then I just socially transitioned.
Interestingly enough, her transition came during what should have been the most important track years of her high school career. The tail end of her time in track and field, she was transitioning.
And what did that mean for her track career? Was she nervous during that transition about what it would mean for her ability to run competitively?
Sadie felt like for a period of time there that she had a choice to make. Either she could be trans or she could be a runner. I think she felt that transitioning would be the end of her athletic career.
For the longest time, I thought that it was kind of one or the other. Either I transition or I continue running. And that's part of the reason why it took so long for me to transition, because I knew I might have to give up track. And towards the end of senior year, it was kind of like the dam started to break, and I needed to transition. It was going to happen one way or the other, and it was starting to hurt too much not to. And so I decided to go through with it, and I had to stop for that year.
The NCAA, which stands for National Collegiate Athletic Association, decided in 2002 that their policy on transgender athlete participation would mirror the guidelines for each international governing body of every sport. And those rules allow Sadie to participate in the female category, in the women's category, after 1 year of gender-affirming hormone replacement therapy, provided that her testosterone levels are within what they consider a fair range.
My testosterone after 1 month on medication was lower than the average cis woman's.
So her entire freshman year of college, it was about taking the therapy, which she continues to do now, getting her testosterone levels to an acceptable amount so that she is able to compete.
Okay, so Sadie graduates high school, starts taking hormones, and is required to take a year off from running. What was that year like for her? And how did she go about making that decision of like, okay, this is what I'm going to do because it matters to me enough to be able to continue competing in the future?
During that year of transitioning, she wasn't able to compete. And as her body changed, she had to relearn her body.
Everything felt off. It didn't feel like I was slow. It felt like my body was different. And I felt like I couldn't push my body to what I usually could.
She talked about just how abnormally slow that she felt, like how her muscles weren't firing the same, how sore she would feel after workouts.
I didn't have the same top speed to any degree, and I didn't have the ability to run fast but run comfortable. My muscles got tired a lot faster. I had days where I would work out on my own because at this time I had stopped with the men's team, and I would blow out my calves doing a workout that would be normally fine for me. I remember not being able to walk for days straight because they were so busted just from doing a normal workout that it destroyed me.
And so it was a difficult time for her as a runner, yet as a human being, as a person, she never felt better. She never felt more like herself. When she looked in the mirror, she saw Sadie, and there was a good vibe that she felt about that. And I think that deep down inside, Sadie needed to do this, and she would have been okay ultimately if she couldn't run again, because she wasn't going to be okay if she was only a runner who was having to deal with all of these differences in identity that she felt inwardly.
So after that 1 year was over, what was it like for her to re-enter the world of college sports?
It's a tough period, right? Like there's the nervousness over how you're going to compete. And you look at Sadie's times. Sadie ran 55 seconds in the 400 meters in middle school. That's her time right now after the gender-affirming hormone replacement therapy. Her career or personal best in high school in the 400 was 50.49 seconds. She believes if not for transitioning, she would be a sub-50 runner, which would very regularly put her in the top 8, making finals, potentially even winning some races if she was in the 48-second range, let's say. So she does feel that her body has changed, and it has cost her some kind of speed.
You know, I'm still struggling to be faster than I was back in 8th grade as a college athlete. And that's purely because of medication. Nothing else has happened. I haven't stopped working out. I haven't changed my routine. It's just the medication that's changed. And for that to be the only variable, I think it's pretty obvious that hormone replacement therapy made me slower and made me more equitable in the women's division.
She's like, please do respect that I've done everything that I can do. I've done everything within the rules that the NCAA stipulates to allow me to compete. However, when she would go and compete, that was a different environment. People calling her names, people whispering about her.
I've gotten called a cheater, like, constantly. That's the biggest one.
That's a man cheating man!
When she started to win, it started to make headlines, and right-wing media captured that as an issue, and they took it over, and she felt there was a lot of misrepresentation of her story.
Can you imagine that being your daughter or your sister going out there playing against a full-grown man?
This is disgusting and disturbing. It's embarrassing and disgusting that you have states or organizations that continue to allow this to happen, allow men to dominate real women.
And it deeply affected her, having to read those stories, having to see those comments on social media, having to see comments on her own social media pages.
No one cares when I don't win. It's only when I'm succeeding or when I'm at my best does anyone really care to throw hate at me for it.
What are the arguments made by people who oppose trans people competing? What are the concerns that they bring up? And why do you think this has become such a lightning rod?
It all comes back to this notion of fair play that we have in sports, which I think is fundamental to the integrity of sports. To me, fair play is ultimately the equal opportunity to win in the way that a sport is structured. And in sports, we understand that people have certain advantages, that certain athletes are faster, certain teams are better. Yet we want to feel like when the whistle blows or the ball is thrown in the air, that everyone has an equal opportunity under the rules to win. And there is a concern that the biological advantages of transgender athletes in the women's space is so great that it skews the playing field to a point in which one day they're going to hold all of the records, they're going to win all of the time, and people are saying in our construct, which we decided long ago, whether right or wrong, that we were going to divide sports between men and women, that in the construct of that it's just fundamentally unfair that you have someone competing who, no matter how they identify, there are certain biological factors that say they are different than some of the others that are competing. And I think that's the one thing that people can't get past.
And what's the actual science behind all of this? Like, what does the science say about whether a trans woman would have a biological advantage in the women's category?
Everything is incredibly murky, and most scientists tell you, here's what my study says right now, but mind you, it's only one step in that direction. I'm not ready to say anything definitive other than these are the findings. This is a short sample size, and there's a lot more to study. But every study, whether it's pro or anti, people take, they bundle it up into a culture war, and we have a complete mess and a wedge issue.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like this has become a highly politicized issue and also a highly legislated issue. There are many states around the country where they are putting in place laws that are preventing transgender people from participating in sports in the way that would make them feel comfortable. Can you talk about those laws and about why we're seeing this rise in legislation around trans participation in sports?
Yeah, it's interesting. In 2020, Idaho became the first state to restrict trans sports participation. The legislation, I think, was just so well crafted that it became the inspiration for a lot of other states. And over the past 4 years, we're up to roughly half of the 50 states now have these bans. Most of them I consider blanket bans that don't accommodate much nuance. I had someone tell me that if they were trying to create the perfect wedge issue, it would be trans participation in women's sports, just because of how our emotions and attitudes are and how we view women as needing to be protected in a certain male dominant society in the way that we think. If you look at the polling and you ask Americans flatly, do you want people who were born male to participate in women's sports? The answer is overwhelmingly no. And that's how you come up with, depending on how you frame the question, that's how you come up with some polling that suggests that on a bipartisan level, 70% of Americans prefer some kind of separation. However, if you ask that simply, do you want your daughter to participate in soccer with a transgender person who might knock them over and hurt them? That's one way of looking at it, but that doesn't consider the nuance of this conversation. So there becomes this energy that we need to protect women, and there becomes this ghost story told that you should fear all transgender people. And I don't think that captures the question at hand here. And I don't think that considers the humanity of the transgender athlete. And I wish that some of these questions would go deeper. And that doesn't mean that you have to support full-on inclusion, but this is something that challenges us to think and to get out of the tribalism of sports and to have a nuanced, deep, thorough discussion, and to understand that one day, one policy, one question is not going to answer everything.
So when it comes to Sadie Schreiner, the trans athlete who you spoke with, where does all this leave her?
She is tested multiple times per track season, indoor and outdoor, at least 4 times. To suppress her testosterone levels, Sadie takes about 6 pills a day right now.
That adds up to being like $120 for 3 months.
She spends a few $100s every lab visit to get tested.
I'm usually shelling out like over $1,000 just to be able to compete and prove that I should be able to compete.
And then she submits those tests to the NCAA at least twice per track season. That's indoor and outdoor season. So that's at least 4 times during the year to stay eligible.
And that's not even talking about mentally what you need to do to prep in order to go to meets. Like, I don't feel confident going outside without makeup, without making myself look as pretty as possible, because I know that people are going to be there recording me or photographing me no matter what I'm doing. So there's a sense of like breach in privacy that you need to always be mentally prepared for.
And so it's a lot more than just going out and running and trying to get your times lower. There's a lot more at play. And so every time she goes out to race, she feels like she's a lightning rod. And so not only are you competing against the other runners, you're also competing against the perception that you are almost criminally unfair. And I think naturally when you wonder, is this worth the hassle? You know, I love track. I was a good track athlete before I would be on the team and not having to deal with this if I were just in the men's category. However, when she thinks about her mental health, she doesn't know what place she would be in right now if she hadn't transitioned. This is truly how she sees herself, and she wanted to live in her truest self.
I think about it for the sake of argument a lot of the times. If I hadn't transitioned, I'd still be a competitive athlete. I'd be living a normal life in college as a photo student and be able to focus on that. And I wouldn't have this incredible burden or stress on me all the time, on me when I compete, on me when I'm just going out in public. But at the end of the day, you have to be true to who you are. You can't just put on a mask for your whole entire life. It's going to break eventually. And I would choose transitioning over running every single day. I just wish that didn't have to be a choice.
After the break, how the world of professional sports is responding to the outrage over trans athletes. We'll be right back. So, Jerry, I'm curious, are there actually a lot of out transgender athletes actually competing right now in the world of sports? Because it seems like there is so much outrage, and you talked about all these laws being passed. But what are the numbers when it comes to how many trans athletes are currently in competition?
The panic is almost laughably disproportionate to the reality. There are about 550,000 collegiate athletes, and there are less than 50 known transgender participants. So when you do that math, I mean, you really got to know small percentages to understand how small that is. And so I do understand and am sympathetic to if a transgender athlete beats your daughter to All-American. Like that's real for a lot of people who have had to deal with that, and they don't care that there's less than 50 among 550,000. They feel that they have been wronged in some way. However, it's almost like you're trying to fight the war you're trying to fight a battle before the war is even started. And it feels so preemptive, and it feels like there's more at play than just sports participation itself.
So, Jerry, obviously Sadie Schreiner is not the only trans athlete who's being attacked for being a trans athlete. And I'm curious, at the professional level, where is this conversation at? And what is the world like right now for professional trans athletes?
Every sport operates a little bit different. Everyone familiar with this issue knows about the swimmer Leah Thomas, who transitioned and started winning, and now she wants to compete at the elite level. However, World Aquatics has banned transgender women who have been through male puberty from competing in women's races. Leah Thomas, to try to qualify for the Olympics, filed an appeal before the Court of Arbitration of Sport, but the 3 judges dismissed her request for arbitration and kicked it back to World Aquatics. So in every sport, whenever there's particularly a prominent athlete who is transgender in the women's space competing, there becomes this existential concern and this forcing of clarification on what the rules are. And so this is something that I think at least for the next 5 years, if not the next decade, will be an ongoing conversation in sports.
So my understanding is that Sadie's dream is to eventually go into professional sports, become a professional runner. What is the likelihood of that? Or what is the outlook for a young trans person who aspires to go into professional sports, looking at the landscape right now?
Looking at the landscape right now, it's incredibly murky.
I know post-college, the future's pretty grim, especially with recent stories with Leah Thomas's lawsuit and how that went. It does not look positive in any sense.
I'm not sure that she sees someone exactly like her who is going to try to have a long career running track. But it matters to Sadie that Megan Rapinoe and Sue Bird, 2 of the greatest female athletes ever, soccer star, basketball star, now retired, are supportive of a high level of inclusion for transgender athletes in women's sports.
The conversation around trans athletes was being hijacked and used to influence politics.
And this, by the way, is Sue Bird, who talked about this on the At Liberty podcast from the ACLU.
And it was like, hold up. Because I've been playing sports a long time, and the trans athlete, particularly in women's sports, has not been a problem. There hasn't been a takeover. This is like fear-mongering at its best.
Megan retired a year ago after her last World Cup with the U.S. women's national team. And during her retirement tour, she did an interview with Time magazine, and she said, we as a country are trying to legislate away people's full humanity related to transgender athletes. That she thinks that this desire that some have to protect female athletes, she wonders, why are you trying to protect me? Why are you trying to speak for me? I can tell you that this is not a problem the way that I view it. Not everyone agrees, and not everyone speaks with the same passion as people who are on the Rapinoe side of the argument. However, I think a lot of them would agree that this is a wedge issue in women's sports, and some of them, particularly on Megan's side, think that it's an intentional wedge to try to interrupt the progress that women have made.
So, having spoken to Sadie and after doing all this thinking about trans athletes, what is your takeaway here? What does Sadie's story tell us about this current moment in the world of sports?
It's a sad portrait. It's us at our worst. And I think we hope that sports can reveal our best character. And this is something that I'm 46 years old, This isn't something that when I was participating in sports was even a conversation or a thought. And now it's here, and our reaction isn't to study and understand and figure out a way to include. Our reaction is ban this, ban that, and the other side is fighting against that. So it's either full inclusion or it's full exclusion. And somewhere in the middle, there's this small number of athletes who society's already tried to marginalize them. And they're on this field of play that is supposed to be welcoming to all. If you've got a love of the game, if you've got a respect for what it means to compete, if you believe in sportsmanship, if you have the desire to train your body properly, there's a place for you here, supposedly. And they're looking at it and saying, you've forgotten about me. And when you think about me, you spit in my face. And that's incredibly sad to think about. That doesn't mean that the answer is allow everyone to do everything without parameters. But I think we're better than that in the sports world. I would hope we're better than that in the sports world. And we're not. And it pains me to think that we might be in a historical moment in which generations go by and we hear about the suffering of people who just wanted to get on a field of play and show you what they could do.
Jerry, thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
Thank you, Martine.
Jerry Brewer is a sports columnist for The Post. And if you want to read Jerry's essays about division and grievance within the world of sports, we will include links in today's show notes. Before you go, I wanted to share a couple more stories from The Post that caught my eye today.
Just a few weeks ago, I was absolutely certain that I would die in Putin's gulag. And now I'm sitting at home and speaking with you, and I'm here with my family, and I could hug my kids, hug my wife, whom I wasn't allowed even to call on the phone from prison.
This is Vladimir Kara-Murza, a Russian journalist, opposition politician, and contributing columnist for the opinion section of The Post. He was one of more than a dozen people released from Russian imprisonment 2 weeks ago, in the largest prisoner swap since the Cold War. We covered that here on the show. Today, Kara-Murza spoke about his release as part of a Washington Post live event. And he talked about what it was like to spend more than 2 years in Russian detention, what the prison was like, how he managed to write behind bars, and the knowledge that gave him comfort and got him through such a bleak experience.
Because I knew that I was right. I knew that the real criminals are those who are waging this aggressive and criminal war against Ukraine, not those of us who have publicly spoken out against it. And when you know that you're right, the fear and the doubt, frankly, just disappear.
You can hear that full interview with Vladimir Kara-Murza over on our opinion podcast, Impromptu. It is a powerful listen. We'll put a link in today's show notes. And finally, a mystery from the ancient world. Researchers at Curtin University in Australia have unlocked a new clue about Stonehenge. That, of course, is the famous prehistoric stone monument southwest of present-day London. They found that the mysterious altar stone at the heart of the monument came all the way from Scotland, more than 500 miles away. That revelation has raised new questions. The stone weighs more than 13,000 pounds. Scientists don't think it was moved by glaciers or by aliens. So there are currently two theories. It could have been dragged across vast stretches of forest and hills. This is before the invention of the wheel, by the way. Or it might have been ferried by sea. Either way, scientists say that schlepping this rock would have taken a lot of organization and could have taken a decade or more. Which raises yet another question. Why? You can read more about how scientists found all this out at WashingtonPost.com. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. If you want to show your support for the show, please subscribe to The Washington Post. Not only is it a great way to help us continue to do this work, but you can now get access to Washington Post podcasts ad-free in Apple Podcasts. Subscribe in Apple Podcasts or by following the link in our show notes. Today's show was produced by Rennie Svirnovsky with help from Emma Talkoff. It was edited by Peter Bresnan with help from Lucy Perkins. It was mixed by Sean Carter. Special thanks to Dan Steinberg and Danelle Wedderburn. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.